At the foot of the Teton Range, where the valley opened wide and the wind came down from the peaks like a river of ice, a Hungarian immigrant was doing something no one in the territory had ever seen. While her neighbors finished their roofs with cedar shakes and pine tar, she was climbing her ladder day after day with burlap sacks full of goose feathers, packing them into every gap between her ceiling and her roof until the entire structure looked like a giant bird's nest. They called her the Feather Woman. They called her the Goose Witch. They called her a fool who would learn the hard way when winter came and her ridiculous insulation rotted or blew away or simply failed to do anything at all. The local rancher, a man named Dawson who had built 20 cabins in his years on the frontier, said she was wasting feathers that should go into pillows and quilts. The other homesteaders' wives whispered that the foreigners always brought strange ideas from the old country, ideas that didn't work in Wyoming, where the winters were harder than anything Europe could imagine. They couldn't understand why any sensible woman would spend 3 months collecting feathers from every goose and duck she could find, when proper insulation meant thick logs and tight chinking and a good hot stove. But that fool woman's feather roof, the one they said would be useless against real cold, it would keep her cabin 25 degrees warmer than any other structure in the valley. And when the killing winter came, her neighbors would burn twice her firewood and still wake shivering while she slept warm under a ceiling packed with the same insulation that kept geese alive through Arctic storms. What did she understand about thermal properties, air pockets, and the ancient wisdom of down insulation that made her feather roof the difference between comfort and suffering through a mountain winter? The woman's name was Ilona Varga. She had come to Wyoming Territory alone in the spring of 1888, 1 year after her husband Sandor died of typhoid fever in a mining camp near Butte, Montana. They had emigrated from a village in the Carpathian Mountains where winters lasted 6 months and survival depended on knowledge passed down through generations of peasant farmers who had learned to work with nature rather than against it. Sandor had been a strong man, but not a careful one. He had trusted American medicine and American doctors and American ways of doing things, and that trust had killed him. Ilona had buried him in Montana soil and traveled south with nothing but a wagon, 2 horses, a flock of 12 geese, and the knowledge her grandmother had given her before she left the old country. The goose knows how to survive the cold, her grandmother had said. Learn from the goose, and you will never freeze. Ilona had not understood those words fully until her first winter in Montana, when she had watched miners and settlers struggle against cold that seemed mild compared to the Carpathian Highlands. They burned enormous quantities of wood. They stuffed rags and moss into every crack in their walls. They wore layers of wool and cotton and leather, and still they shivered, still they suffered, still they woke with frost on their blankets and ice in their water buckets. But the geese, her 12 geese that she kept in a small shelter behind whatever cabin or tent she occupied, they seemed unbothered by temperatures that sent grown men running for their stoves. They fluffed their feathers and tucked their heads, and stood calmly in conditions that should have frozen them solid. The cold couldn't touch them. They carried their insulation with them, a layer of down so effective that it held their body heat against their skin, even when the air around them dropped to 40 below. That first Montana winter, Ilona had begun experimenting. She collected the feathers her geese shed naturally, supplementing them with down from the wild ducks she shot for food. She stuffed the feathers into cloth bags and placed them against the walls of her cabin, testing whether the insulation that worked for birds would work for buildings. The results were modest but promising. The areas backed by feather bags stayed noticeably warmer than bare walls, and the feathers remained dry and functional throughout the season. By the time she moved to Wyoming in the spring of 1889, she had developed a plan. She would build a cabin designed from the ground up to use feather insulation, not as a supplement to conventional construction, but as the primary barrier against cold. The ceiling would be the key. Heat rose, and most cabins lost the majority of their warmth through roofs that were little more than wooden planks with gaps between them. If she could create an unbroken layer of down insulation between her living space and the outside air, she could trap heat that other cabins simply threw away. Her homestead claim sat on good land at the base of the mountains, with timber for building and grass for her animals, and a creek that ran year-round with snowmelt from the peaks above. She spent the summer constructing her cabin with help from a Shoshone woman named Laughing Bird, who lived in the foothills and understood immediately what Ilona was trying to accomplish. "The old ones used buffalo hair," Laughing Bird told her. "Packed between hides, it holds warmth like nothing else. Your goose feathers will work the same way." The cabin measured 16 by 20 feet, larger than most homesteader shacks, but necessary to accommodate the insulation system Ilona had designed. The walls were standard log construction, chinked with moss and clay and sealed as tight as she could make them. The floor was packed earth covered with wooden planking, with a layer of dried grass beneath for modest insulation. The stove was a cast iron model she had hauled from Butte, positioned in the center of the cabin where its heat could radiate in all directions. But the ceiling was where the real innovation lay. Instead of the single layer of planking that most builders used, Ilona constructed a double ceiling with an 8-inch gap between the layers. The lower ceiling, which formed the visible interior surface of her living space, was made from carefully fitted pine boards, sanded smooth and sealed with a mixture of beeswax and pine pitch to prevent air infiltration. The upper layer, which sat directly beneath the roof shakes, was rougher construction. Boards laid with small gaps between them to allow air circulation and prevent moisture accumulation. Between these two layers, she would pack her feathers. The collection had begun in Montana and continued throughout the Wyoming summer. Her flock of geese provided a steady supply of naturally shed down, which she gathered every few days and stored in cotton bags hung from the rafters of her temporary shelter. She hunted ducks along the creek, plucking their breast feathers before cooking the meat. She traded with Laughing Bird's people for feathers they had collected from waterfowl and wild turkeys. She even purchased several pounds of goose down from a farming family near Jackson, who raised birds for meat and had no use for the feathers. By late September, she had accumulated over 60 pounds of down and feathers, enough, by her calculations, to fill the ceiling cavity to a depth of 6 inches throughout the entire cabin. The insulation value of this layer would be extraordinary, equivalent to several feet of solid wood or dozens of wool blankets. Air trapped between the individual barbs of each feather would create millions of tiny pockets that resisted heat transfer, while the structure of the down itself would remain lofted and effective even under the weight of additional material above. The preparation of the feathers was as important as the collection. Raw feathers carried oils and dirt and sometimes parasites that could degrade the insulation over time or attract pests to the ceiling cavity. Ilona spent long evenings cleaning her harvest, washing the down in water heated over her campfire, then spreading it on canvas sheets to dry in the autumn sun. The washing removed impurities while preserving the natural structure of the feathers, and the drying prevented mold from forming in storage. Once clean and dry, the feathers received a treatment her grandmother had developed in the old country, a light coating of cedar oil mixed with dried lavender, applied by tumbling the down in a cloth bag with the aromatic mixture. The cedar repelled insects and rodents, while the lavender added a pleasant scent and additional pest resistance. Feathers treated this way would remain effective for decades, maintaining their loft and insulation value long after untreated down had compressed into useless mats. Laughing Bird contributed her own knowledge to the preparation process, showing Ilona how to sort feathers by type for different purposes. The large flight feathers from wings and tails were set aside for other uses: quills, fletching, decorative work. The small contour feathers that covered the birds' bodies were good for stuffing pillows and mattresses. But the true treasure was the down, the tiny, fluffy clusters that grew close to the skin, each one a miracle of natural engineering designed to trap air and hold heat against the bird's body. Down made up only a small fraction of each bird's plumage, which was why Ilona needed so many sources to fill her ceiling cavity. A single goose might yield 2 or 3 ounces of usable down, meaning her 60-pound accumulation represented the contribution of hundreds of birds over many months. The effort was enormous, but the result would justify every hour spent plucking and washing and sorting. The packing process began on the first day of October, with Laughing Bird helping to pass the sacks up the ladder while Ilona worked on the roof. She had removed a section of the upper ceiling boards to create an access point, and through this opening she fed handful after handful of feathers into the cavity below. The work was slow and messy. Down floated everywhere, coating her hair and clothes and skin until she looked like a human goose herself. But gradually, the cavity filled, the feathers compressing slightly under their own weight, but maintaining enough loft to provide effective insulation. Her neighbors came to watch, and their reactions ranged from amusement to outright mockery. Dawson rode by on the 3rd day of the packing process, stopping his horse at the edge of her clearing to observe the spectacle of a woman covered in feathers stuffing more feathers into her roof. "You're building a nest," he called out, his voice carrying the patient condescension of a man who had seen many foolish things in his years on the frontier. "That's fine for birds, but people need real insulation, wood and tar and good thick walls." Ilona didn't stop working. She had learned that arguing with men who thought they knew everything was a waste of breath, better spent on labor. "My grandmother survived 70 winters in the Carpathian Mountains," she said. "She taught me what she knew. I trust her knowledge more than yours." Dawson shook his head and rode on, but his wife returned 2 days later with a delegation of women from the valley who wanted to see the feather roof for themselves. They climbed the ladder one by one, peering into the cavity where 6 inches of white down now covered the entire ceiling surface, a fluffy blanket that seemed far too soft and insubstantial to provide any real protection against Wyoming winters. "It'll rot," one woman said. "Feathers hold moisture. By spring you'll have a ceiling full of mold and mildew." "It'll blow away," another added. "First good wind that gets under your roof, and you'll have feathers scattered from here to the mountains." "It'll attract mice," a third woman warned. "They'll nest in there and breed all winter, and come spring, you'll have a cabin full of vermin." Ilona listened to each objection and responded with the same calm certainty. "The upper ceiling has gaps for ventilation. Moisture will escape before it can accumulate. I've treated the feathers with cedar oil to repel insects and rodents, and the cavity is sealed from below. No wind can reach the down unless the roof itself fails, and if the roof fails, I have bigger problems than scattered feathers." The women left unconvinced, certain that the strange Hungarian would learn her lesson when winter arrived. The first test came in early November, when a cold snap dropped temperatures to 15 below zero and brought winds that rattled windows throughout the valley. Ilona woke that first morning to a cabin that felt noticeably warmer than any structure she had occupied in Montana, despite burning no more wood than usual. The cast-iron stove had gone cold hours before, but the interior temperature still hovered around 45 degrees. Cool, but survivable, and far warmer than the single-digit temperatures outside. She rebuilt the fire and watched the cabin warm rapidly to a comfortable 65 degrees, a temperature it maintained throughout the day on half the wood she had expected to burn. The heat from the stove rose to the ceiling, where the feather insulation trapped it like a blanket traps body heat, preventing the rapid loss that plagued every other cabin in the valley. By contrast, her nearest neighbor, a bachelor farmer named Jensen, who had built his cabin the conventional way, was burning wood at a rate that would exhaust his winter supply before February. His roof, a single layer of shakes over rough planking, leaked heat so rapidly that his stove ran constantly just to maintain temperatures in the low 50s. The cold radiated down from his ceiling like water through a sieve, and no amount of fuel could compensate for insulation that simply wasn't there. The real test came in January. The winter of 1889-1890 would be remembered as one of the hardest in territorial history, a season of storms and cold snaps that killed cattle by the thousands and drove families from homesteads they had worked for years to establish. The first major blizzard arrived on January 14th, dropping temperatures to 35 below zero and bringing winds that piled snow in drifts 20 feet deep against any structure that stood in their path. For 3 days, the storm raged without pause. Visibility dropped to zero. The wind screamed across the valley like a living thing, finding every crack and gap in every cabin, forcing cold air through seams that had seemed tight enough in autumn but now leaked like sieves. Families huddled around their stoves, feeding wood into fireboxes that couldn't keep pace with the cold pouring through their roofs, watching their carefully stacked winter supplies dwindle at rates that promised catastrophe before spring. The Murphy family, 2 miles north of Ilona's claim, burned through half their remaining firewood in those 3 days. Their cabin, built quickly the previous summer with a single-layer roof of rough planking, offered almost no resistance to the cold that pressed down from above. The interior temperature never rose above 40 degrees, despite a fire that consumed logs at 3 times the normal rate. Their children slept in their coats, wrapped in every blanket the family owned, and still woke shivering in the blue darkness before dawn. The Hendersons, a young couple with an infant daughter, faced an even more desperate situation. Their tiny cabin had been built for economy rather than warmth, with walls barely 8 inches thick and a roof that had already begun to leak around the chimney pipe. By the second day of the storm, ice was forming on the inside of their walls, and the baby's cries had taken on a hoarse, weak quality that terrified her parents more than the howling wind outside. Ilona's cabin, positioned in the lee of a low ridge that broke the worst of the wind, weathered the storm without incident. The feather insulation performed exactly as she had designed it, maintaining interior temperatures in the 50s, even when the stove burned low and the wind screamed across the valley like a living thing intent on killing everything it touched. She burned 4 logs per day during the worst of the cold, less than half what her neighbors consumed, and slept warm every night under quilts that barely seemed necessary. The temperature differential was remarkable. On the morning of January 17th, when the outside air registered 42 below zero, Ilona's cabin interior measured 61 degrees with a moderate fire burning. The ceiling above her felt warm to the touch, the feather insulation holding heat so effectively that almost none escaped through the roof. By contrast, Jensen's cabin, measured that same morning, registered 38 degrees inside despite a roaring fire that consumed wood at 3 times Ilona's rate. His ceiling was cold enough to form frost on the inside surface, the moisture from his breath condensing and freezing on planks that offered almost no resistance to the brutal cold above. 23 degrees of difference. The gap between comfort and misery. The gap between a winter survived and a winter endured. Word spread through the valley as the storms continued and the cold deepened. The Feather Woman's cabin stayed warm. The Feather Woman burned half the wood. The Feather Woman slept comfortable, while families in conventional cabins huddled around their stoves and prayed for spring. Dawson was the first to ask for help. He appeared at Ilona's door on a February morning, hat in hand, his face wearing the expression of a man who had been wrong and knew it. His wife and 3 children had spent the past week sleeping in the same room, crowded around a stove that couldn't keep pace with the cold leaking through their ceiling. They had burned through most of their winter wood supply, with 2 months of cold still ahead, and the choice facing them was stark. Find better insulation or abandon their homestead until spring. "I mocked you," Dawson said. "I called your roof foolish. I was wrong." Ilona invited him inside, where the warmth of her cabin made the contrast with his own impossible to ignore. She poured him coffee and explained the principles that her grandmother had taught her. The air pockets trapped between feather barbs, the way down maintained its loft, even under compression. The importance of creating a sealed cavity where the insulation could do its work without interference from wind or moisture. "It's not magic," she said. "It's just understanding what the birds already know. They survive winters that would kill any man, and they do it with nothing but feathers. The same feathers will protect a house if you use them correctly." Dawson couldn't rebuild his ceiling in the middle of winter, but Ilona helped him implement a temporary solution. Bags of feathers and down packed against his ceiling from the inside, hung from the rafters to create an improvised insulation layer. The improvement was immediate and significant, raising his interior temperatures by 15 degrees and cutting his wood consumption by 1/3. It wasn't as effective as a properly constructed feather ceiling, but it was enough to get his family through the winter without abandoning their home. By spring, 3 other families had approached Ilona for advice on feather insulation. By the following autumn, 6 new cabins in the valley featured double ceilings packed with down, built according to specifications that Ilona provided freely to anyone who asked. The technique spread slowly. Most settlers still preferred conventional construction, trusting the methods their fathers and grandfathers had used. But those who adopted the feather system never went back to single-layer roofs that leaked heat like sieves. The Hendersons were among the first converts. Their infant daughter had survived that terrible January storm, but the experience had shaken them badly enough that they spent the entire following summer rebuilding their cabin according to Ilona's design. The husband, a carpenter by training, improved on her original concept, adding a 3rd layer to the ceiling that created 2 separate insulation cavities, one packed with feathers, one left as dead airspace for additional thermal resistance. Their rebuilt cabin proved even more efficient than Ilona's original, maintaining comfortable temperatures on barely 3 logs per day during the coldest weeks of the following winter. Jensen, the bachelor farmer who had nearly burned through his entire wood supply during that first terrible cold snap, took a different approach. Unable to afford the time or materials for a complete rebuild, he developed a system of removable feather panels that could be hung from the ceiling during winter and stored during summer. The panels were less effective than permanent installation, but they reduced his fuel consumption by 40% and made his cabin comfortable enough to survive even the worst storms without the desperate measures he had employed before. The Murphy family moved away the following spring, broken by a winter that had taken most of their livestock and nearly taken their children. But before they left, the father spent a long afternoon with Ilona, learning the principles of feather insulation so that wherever he rebuilt, he would never again watch his family shiver through a winter in a cabin that couldn't hold heat. He took detailed notes and a bag of treated down as a starter supply, promising to spread the technique wherever he settled. Ilona lived in her cabin for another 31 years, until her death in the winter of 1920 at the age of 67. The feather insulation she had installed in 1889 was still functional when her nephew arrived from Hungary to settle her estate. The down had compressed slightly over the decades, but still maintained enough loft to provide significant insulation value. He found her cabin warm and dry, her woodpile barely touched despite a winter that had already lasted 3 months, her stove cold, but the interior temperature still hovering in the 40s from heat retained by walls and ceiling that refused to let warmth escape. The nephew kept the cabin and the feather roof, adding to the insulation layer with down from Ilona's geese, descendants of the original flock she had brought from Montana 30 years before. The birds still wandered the property, still shed their feathers every season, still provided the raw material for insulation that outperformed anything modern builders could offer. Some lessons take a long time to learn. Some people never learn them at all. But the geese know. The geese have always known. And the woman who listened to her grandmother, who trusted the wisdom of birds over the mockery of neighbors, stayed warm for 31 years while the valley around her struggled through winters that should have been just as comfortable. The feathers are still there, packed between the ceiling layers, holding heat the way they held it a century ago. The cabin still stands. And every winter, when the wind comes down from the Tetons and the cold settles into the valley like something alive and hungry, the walls stay warm and the stove burns low, and the ghost of a Hungarian woman smiles at the neighbors who laughed at her feather roof. They're not laughing anymore.